Hello, my love. Welcome to Stories with Oge Pleasure. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Please share the video with friends and loved ones. Also turn on the notifications to get notified for next stories. Sit back, let's dive into the story.
James Okafor stepped into the spacious living room of his Lekki apartment, loosening his tie as the faint hum of traffic filtered through the tinted windows. The air conditioning hummed softly, providing a welcome relief from the Lagos heat. His wife, Clara, sat at the dining table, her laptop open, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Clara, I'm home," he called, though his voice lacked warmth. "Welcome," she replied absently, barely glancing up from her screen. Their 6-year-old son, David, was sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to the television. The cartoon characters on the screen leapt and tumbled, but David's face was devoid of emotion. Beside him, a half-eaten plate of jollof rice rested precariously on the armrest. "David, say good evening to your dad," Clara said, still typing. "Good evening, Daddy," David mumbled, not looking away from the TV. James sighed, walking past without replying. He was too exhausted to reprimand the boy for his lack of enthusiasm. The Okafors were a picture-perfect couple on the outside. Both were ambitious professionals. James a top executive in a multinational company and Clara a rising star in a prestigious law firm. Their combined income afforded them a life of luxury, but time was a currency they rarely spent on their son. From the moment David was born, they had relied heavily on their nanny, Mrs. Kate, to handle his upbringing. Miss Kate, a young lady, did the bare minimum. She cooked, cleaned, and ensured David was physically safe, but she lacked the warmth or patience to nurture him emotionally. Most days, she handed him a remote control and left him to entertain himself. One evening, Clara noticed something peculiar. She had returned from work earlier than usual and found David watching a movie that was clearly inappropriate for his age. The screen showed scenes of violence, and the language was far from child-friendly. "David," Clara snapped, grabbing the remote. "What are you watching?" David looked startled but quickly masked it with indifference. "Just something on TV." "This isn't for children," she scolded, switching the channel to a Cartoon Network. "Kate lets me watch it," David muttered under his breath, but Clara heard him. Later that night she called Kate, but she denied it. "Madam, I cannot monitor him every second. He knows how to change the channels himself." Clara wanted to argue but was too tired to press the issue. She decided it wasn't worth the energy. After all, it was just television. Weeks turned into months, and small warnings began to surface. David's teacher sent notes home about his disruptive behavior in class. "He doesn't listen," one note read. "He struggles to follow instructions." Clara dismissed it as a phase. "All boys are mischievous," she told herself. James agreed, brushing it off with a laugh. "He'll outgrow it. Boys will be boys." David, however, wasn't just being mischievous. He had started stealing small things, pencils, snacks, even money from Clara's purse. When confronted, he lied with an alarming ease. "David, did you take this?" Clara asked one evening, holding up a crumpled N500 note. "No," he said, his face blank. She knew he was lying but didn't push further. She had a court case to prepare for and couldn't afford the distraction. One Saturday morning, James decided to take a day off. He envisioned spending time with his son, maybe playing football or visiting the amusement park. But when he suggested it, David shook his head. "I want to watch TV," the boy said flatly. James frowned. "David, we don't spend much time together. Let's do something fun." "No," David insisted, turning back to the screen. The rejection stung, but James hid it behind a facade of indifference. "Suit yourself," he muttered, retreating to his study. Clara, overhearing the exchange, felt a pang of guilt. "Maybe we should spend more time with him," she said to James later that evening. "And how do you propose we do that, Clara?" James shot back. "Cancel all our meetings. Lose our clients. Everything we do is for him." Clara didn't respond, but deep down she wasn't convinced. One afternoon Kate returned from the market and found David missing. Panic gripped her as she searched the house, calling his name. Eventually, she found him at a nearby shop, surrounded by older boys. They were laughing and whispering, and David looked up guiltily when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, dragging him home. That evening, Kate reported the incident to Clara, who was furious. "How could you let this happen?" she yelled. "Madam, I can't be everywhere at once," Kate retorted. The tension between Clara and Kate escalated, but rather than addressing the root cause of the problem, David's lack of parental attention, Clara chose to fire her. With Kate gone, James and Clara assumed things would improve. They decided to enroll David in extracurricular activities to keep him busy. But the damage was already done. David had learned to navigate life without boundaries, and his rebellion was only beginning.
David's rebellion continued to unfold like a slow-burning tragedy. By the time he was 11, he had become a familiar face in the streets. Despite the gated community's outward appearance of affluence and order, it harbored corners where unruly boys gathered, out of sight and out of mind. David found a second home in these circles, bonding with older boys who saw his defiance as a potential asset. It was a Thursday afternoon when Clara received another call from David's school. She sighed, already anticipating what it was about. "Mrs. Okafor, this is Principal Akala," the voice on the line began. "We need you and your husband to come in tomorrow morning. It's about David." Clara's heart sank. "What has he done this time, sir?" "I'd rather discuss it in person," the principal replied curtly. Clara dropped the call and immediately called James. "The school has summoned us again," she said. "Again?" James groaned. "What now?" "I don't know. But we both need to be there." The next morning, they sat across from Principal Akala, who wore a stern expression. "David is a smart boy, but his behavior has become a major issue," the principal began. "He disrupts classes, disrespects teachers, and has been caught stealing several times." Clara and James exchanged uneasy glances. "We even found him with a mobile phone containing inappropriate content," the principal continued. "Where did he get that phone?" James frowned. "We didn't give him any phone." "Then he must have stolen it," the principal said. "This behavior cannot continue. If things don't improve, we may have to expel him." "Expel?" Clara gasped. "Yes. We cannot allow one child to disrupt the education of others." James promised the principal they would address the issue. But as they left the school, their discussion turned into an argument. "This is your fault," Clara snapped. "My fault? How?" James shot back. "You've been too dismissive. Boys will be boys, remember? Now look where that attitude has gotten us. And you think you're innocent? You're always too busy with your cases to even notice what's happening under your own roof." The fight continued all the way home, but neither realized that David, who had been eavesdropping from a distance, heard every word. David's behavior worsened as he spent hours with his new friends, who introduced him to petty crimes like pickpocketing and shoplifting. These activities gave him a thrill and, in his mind, a sense of belonging that he lacked at home. One day, he and his crew ventured to a nearby market. "David, you're the smallest," Tund whispered. "Go grab that woman's bag." David hesitated, his palms sweaty. "Don't chicken out," another boy teased. Steeling himself, David moved forward, snatched the bag, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and exhilaration. Later, the boys celebrated their success, splitting the money among themselves. David felt a strange pride, even as guilt lingered at the back of his mind. Clara began to notice subtle changes in David. He started coming home late, often with flimsy excuses. His once tidy appearance became disheveled, and money occasionally went missing from her purse. One evening, she decided to search his room while he was out. What she found left her shaken: a wad of cash hidden under his mattress, along with a smartphone she didn't recognize. When David returned, she confronted him. "David, where did you get this money?" "I saved it," he lied, his face a mask of defiance. "Don't lie to me," Clara shouted. "Tell me the truth." David remained silent, his eyes cold and unyielding. When James returned home, Clara showed him what she had found. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should send him to boarding school," James suggested. A strict environment might straighten him out. Clara wasn't convinced. What if it makes things worse? "We need to be more involved, James. And neglect our jobs?" James countered. "We can't just drop everything." Once again, they failed to reach a conclusion, leaving David to continue down his dangerous path. The first major wake-up call came when the police knocked on their door late one night. Clara opened it to find two officers standing there, with David in handcuffs. "Good evening, ma'am," one officer said. "We caught your son loitering with known troublemakers. They were attempting to vandalize a shop." "What? David, is this true?" Clara shouted. David avoided her gaze, his expression unreadable. James appeared behind her, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "Officer, there must be some mistake. David is just a child." "He's not as innocent as you think, sir," the officer replied. After much pleading, the officers agreed to release David with a warning. But as they left, one of them said, "Next time, we won't be so lenient." That night, the house was in chaos. James shouted at David, calling him ungrateful and a disgrace. Clara cried, begging him to explain why he was acting this way. "I hate this house." David finally screamed, "I hate both of you." His words hung in the air like a slap. "You don't mean that," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, I do," David yelled. "You don't care about me. All you care about is your stupid jobs." James raised his hand as if to strike him, but Clara stepped in. "James, don't." David stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind. He sat in his room, plotting his next move. He was determined to escape the suffocating environment of his home, even if it meant diving deeper into the world of crime. David's life became a whirlwind of chaos and crime as he grew bolder in his association with the Kings. The gang, emboldened by their recent successes, began taking on more daring and dangerous activities. David, still only a teenager, found himself trapped in a lifestyle that was spiraling further out of control. One rainy evening, the Kings planned a high-stakes operation. A wealthy businessman's mansion was their target. "Listen up," Rambo said as the gang gathered in a dimly lit room. "This is a big one. If we pull it off, we'll be set for months. David, you'll be the lookout." David nodded, though his hands trembled. The thought of getting caught filled him with dread, but the need to prove himself outweighed his fear. As the gang entered the compound, David stood outside, nervously scanning the street. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. Suddenly, a car turned into the street, its headlights illuminating the driveway. "They're coming back," David hissed into the walkie-talkie. "Delay them," Rambo barked. David hesitated, then stepped into the middle of the road, waving his arms. "Hey, stop," he shouted. The driver, startled, slammed on the brakes. David quickly concocted a story about a lost dog, buying the gang enough time to escape over the back fence. When they regrouped later, Rambo clapped him on the back. "Good work, kid. You're one of us now." David forced a smile, but inside, he felt hollow. Back at home, Clara was at her wit's end. She had tried everything, pleading, punishing, even bribing David to change his ways, but nothing worked. Her once bright and cheerful son was now a stranger. She decided to visit Pastor Gabriel, the family's spiritual leader. Sitting across from him in his modest office, she poured out her heart. "Pastor, I don't know what to do anymore. David is out of control." Pastor Gabriel listened patiently. "Clara, you and James have to fight for your son. This isn't just a physical battle, it's a spiritual one too. You must pray for him, but you must also show him love, even when it's difficult." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure how much more love she had left to give. James, meanwhile, had grown increasingly frustrated. One evening, he confronted David after finding a stash of money hidden under his mattress. "Where did you get this?" James demanded, holding up the cash. David shrugged. "It's none of your business." "It is my business. I'm your father." "You're nothing to me," David shot back. James's face darkened. "If you walk out of this house again, don't bother coming back." David smirked.
Fine.
I won't. He grabbed his backpack and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Clara watched helplessly, tears streaming down her face. James, you can't just throw him out like that. I didn't throw him out, James retorted. He made his choice. With nowhere else to go, David dove deeper into his life with the Kings. But their success had drawn the attention of rival gangs. One fateful night, Rambo announced that they were going to send a message to a rival gang known as the Vipers. We can't let them think they can mess with us, he said. The plan was simple: ambush the Vipers at their hideout and destroy their stash of weapons. David's job was to act as the lookout once again. The attack was chaotic and brutal. As gunshots echoed through the night, David hid in the shadows, his heart pounding. When it was over, 2 members of the Vipers lay dead, and the Kings had made their escape. But the victory was short-lived. The Vipers vowed revenge, and David found himself living in constant fear. Clara was growing desperate. She began tracking David's movements, sometimes driving around the neighborhood late at night in the hope of finding him. One evening, she spotted him hanging out with the Kings near a rundown building. Summoning her courage, she got out of the car and approached him. David, please come home, she begged. David turned to her, his face hard. I told you I don't need you. You're my son, Clara said, her voice breaking. I can't just give up on you. Then stop trying, David replied coldly. Rambo and the others laughed, and Clara felt a wave of humiliation. She walked back to her car, her heart shattered. At home, James sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The weight of his failure as a father pressed heavily on him. He remembered the day David was born, the joy he and Clara had felt. How had they gone from that moment to this? When Clara returned, he looked up. Did you find him? Yes, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. James nodded, but he didn't ask what had happened. Clara knelt by her bed, praying through her tears, while James sat in silence, his heart heavy with regret. David's attempt to withdraw from the Kings was short-lived. The gang wasn't just a group of friends, it was a dangerous brotherhood that didn't take betrayal lightly. His hesitation to continue participating in their activities made him a target of suspicion among his peers. The Vipers, too, were not done seeking revenge. Tensions between the gangs reached a boiling point, and David found himself caught in a web of violence, fear, and manipulation. The phone call David received late that night was from Peter, one of Rambo's closest allies. David, you think you can just walk away? Peter's voice was sharp and cold. I'm not walking away, David lied, gripping the phone tightly. I've just been laying low. Well, it's time to prove you're still with us, Peter said. Meet us at the abandoned warehouse tomorrow night. Don't be late. David hung up, his heart pounding. He knew he couldn't keep this charade up for long. Clara sensed that something was wrong. David had been unusually quiet since his arrest, and while she initially thought it was a sign of change, her motherly intuition told her otherwise. One afternoon, she sat across from James in the living room. We need to do something, James. I feel like we're losing him for good. James sighed, running a hand over his face. What do you want me to do, Clara? We've tried everything. He doesn't listen to us. Clara's voice broke as she said, what if something happens to him? What if the next time we see him is in a morgue? James looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The following night, David arrived at the warehouse as instructed. The air was thick with tension as Peter and a few other members of the Kings waited. We have a job, Peter said. The Vipers have been using a mechanic shop as a front. Tonight we're going to burn it down. David's stomach churned. Why me? He asked cautiously. Because you've been acting funny lately, Peter said, narrowing his eyes. We need to know we can trust you. David nodded, masking his fear. Back at home, Clara stayed up, praying fervently for her son. She hadn't seen him leave the house, but when she checked his room, it was empty. James, she called, shaking him awake. David's gone again. James groaned. Clara, what do you want me to do? It's the middle of the night. I don't know, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. But I can't just sit here and do nothing. She knelt by the bed, clutching her Bible, and prayed like never before. At the mechanic shop, David and the gang carried out their plan. Armed with bottles of petrol and matches, they moved swiftly, ensuring the place was empty before setting it ablaze. The flames roared to life, illuminating the night sky. David stood frozen, the heat licking at his face as he watched the fire consume the building. "Let's go," Peter shouted, dragging him away. As they fled, David couldn't shake the image of the flames. He felt like he was burning along with the shop, his soul charred by the choices he had made. The following week, David found himself walking home late at night when he was ambushed by 2 members of the Vipers. "You thought you could get away with that," one of them snarled, pinning him against a wall. David struggled, but the other boy pulled out a knife. "You're going to pay for what you did," he said. Before they could act, a police patrol car turned the corner, its headlights flooding the alley. The boys scattered, leaving David shaken and gasping for air. When David stumbled into the house that night, James was waiting. "Where have you been?" James demanded, his tone harsher than usual. David didn't answer, his clothes disheveled and his face pale. "David, I'm talking to you," James shouted. "Leave me alone." David snapped, pushing past him. James grabbed his arm. "No. You're going to tell me what's going on, or so help me. I'm in trouble, okay?" David blurted out, tears streaming down his face. "And I don't know how to get out of it." James froze, his anger dissipating as he saw the fear in his son's eyes. "What kind of trouble?" he asked quietly. David hesitated before saying, "It's the Kings. I don't think I can leave." James and Clara spent the next few days formulating a plan to get David out of the gang. They contacted Ngozi, who suggested involving the police. "It's risky," Ngozi warned. "But if we can get them to intervene, David might have a chance to start over." David, however, was terrified. "If they find out I snitched, they'll kill me," he said. "We'll protect you," James promised, though he wasn't sure how. David received another call from Peter. "This isn't over, David," Peter said ominously. "We have one last job, and you'd better show up. If you don't," he trailed off, but the threat was clear. David sat in silence after the call, his hands trembling. He knew that whatever came next would change his life forever. The day after Peter's threatening call, David sat alone in his room, staring at his phone. The message was clear: show up or suffer the consequences. When Clara walked in, she saw the fear etched on his face. "David, talk to me," she said softly. David looked up, his eyes glassy. "You don't understand, Mom. If I don't go, they'll come for me. They'll come for you, and Dad too." Clara's heart sank. She knelt beside him, placing her hands on his knees. "We'll protect you," she said. "But you have to trust us." David shook his head. "You can't protect me from them." James had reached his breaking point. That evening, while Clara was at work, he drove to the nearest police station and asked to speak with the divisional officer. "My son is caught up in a gang," James began, his voice trembling. "And I need your help to get him out before it's too late." The officer, a middle-aged man named DSP Okachukwu, listened carefully. "We've been monitoring both gangs for a while now," DSP Okachukwu said. "But infiltrating them has been difficult. If your son is willing to cooperate, we can use his information to take them down." James hesitated. "That sounds dangerous." "It is," the officer admitted. "But it's the best chance he has to get out." When James told Clara about his meeting with the police, she was furious. "You want to put our son in more danger," she shouted. "He's already in danger," James retorted. "This might be the only way to save him." Clara paced the living room, her mind racing. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," James said firmly. "We have to trust the police." Reluctantly, Clara agreed, though her heart was heavy with fear. David was reluctant when his father told him about the plan. "You want me to snitch on the Kings?" he asked incredulously. "It's the only way," James said. "The police will protect you." "They can't protect me from everyone," David muttered. But after hours of coaxing and promises of support, David finally agreed. The next evening, David met with Peter and the gang at a secluded location. Unbeknownst to them, Plainclothes officers were stationed nearby, watching and waiting for the right moment. Peter explained their plan, a final raid on the Vipers to end the feud once and for all. "This is it," Peter said. "After this, they won't mess with us again." David nodded, though his heart was pounding. As the gang members dispersed, David slipped away and sent a text to DSP Okechukwu, "It's happening tonight. They're heading to the old factory in Mushin." When the Kings arrived at the factory, they were armed and ready for war. But as they prepared to strike, police sirens blared in the distance. "Cops!" someone shouted. Panic erupted as officers swarmed the area, blocking every exit. Shots were fired, and chaos ensued. David, unarmed and terrified, hid behind a stack of crates, praying he wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. In the chaos, Peter spotted David trying to flee. Realization dawned on him. "You set us up!" Peter screamed, charging at David. David stumbled back, raising his hands. "I didn't have a choice." Peter swung at him, but before he could land a blow, an officer tackled him to the ground. David watched in shock as Peter was handcuffed and dragged away, his face twisted in fury. Several members of the Kings were arrested, and their stronghold was dismantled. The Vipers, too, suffered heavy losses as the police cracked down on both gangs. David was taken into protective custody, where he met with DSP Okechukwu. "You did a brave thing tonight," the officer said. "But it's not over yet. There will be consequences." David nodded, his face pale. He knew that even with the gang dismantled, his life would never be the same. When David returned home under police escort, Clara and James were waiting. Clara hugged him tightly, sobbing into his shoulder. "You're safe now," she whispered. But David felt anything but safe. The guilt of betraying the gang weighed heavily on him, and he knew he had made powerful enemies. As the family tried to rebuild their lives, a sense of unease lingered. Clara and James were hopeful, but David remained distant, haunted by nightmares and paranoia. David answers a call, and a familiar voice speaks. "You think this is over, David? We're coming for you." David's blood runs cold as the line goes dead. David told his parents about the call, and the tension in the house was unbearable. Since the phone call, David had been living in constant fear. Every noise outside felt like a threat, every shadow like a lurking danger. Clara and James, while trying to support their son, were also struggling to come to terms with the reality that danger might soon knock on their door. David spent most of his days locked in his room, staring out the window as if expecting someone to jump out from the bushes. Clara noticed his deteriorating mental state and decided to talk to him. "David," she began softly, sitting beside him on the bed. "You can't keep living like this. You've done the right thing, and now it's time to heal." David shook his head. "You don't understand, Mom. They'll never stop coming for me. Peter and the others, they don't forgive." Clara hugged him tightly. "You're not alone in this. We'll protect you no matter what." James wasn't taking any chances. He installed security cameras around the house and made sure all doors and windows were reinforced. He also kept in close contact with DSP Okechukwu, who promised to send patrol officers to the neighborhood regularly. But James couldn't shake the feeling that danger was inevitable. One evening, as he sat in the living room, he confided in Clara. "I don't think the police can keep us safe forever," he said. "We might need to leave Lagos." Clara looked at him in shock. "Leave? This is our home, James." "Our home isn't safe anymore," James said firmly. "Think about David. If staying here means losing him, then it's not worth." 3 nights later, a chilling message arrived. James found it taped to the front gate. "We're watching you." He immediately called DSP Okechukwu, who assured him that they were monitoring the situation. But the message rattled the entire family. "What do they want?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "They want revenge," James replied grimly. David, overhearing the conversation, felt the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "This is my fault," he muttered. "If I hadn't gotten involved with the Kings, none of this would have happened." "It's not your fault," Clara said firmly. "You made mistakes, yes, but you're trying to make things right." The threat escalated a few days later. As David walked back from a nearby convenience store, he was ambushed by two masked men. "You thought you could betray us," one of them snarled, pinning him against a wall. David struggled, panic surging through him. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," the other man growled, pulling out a knife. Before they could harm him, a police patrol car turned the corner, and the men fled. David collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably. When David recounted the ambush to his parents, James was livid. "This is enough," he shouted. "We're leaving Lagos tomorrow. I'm not going to wait for them to attack us in our own home." Clara hesitated. "But what about our jobs, the house, everything we've built here?" "None of that matters if we lose David," James said, his voice cracking. David, however, disagreed. "I'm not running," he said quietly. "David," James began, but his son cut him off. "I've been running all my life, Dad. If they want to come for me, let them. I'll face them." That night, as the family sat together in the living room, the power suddenly went out. "Stay here," James said, grabbing a flashlight and heading to the breaker box. As he stepped outside, he noticed a group of men lurking near the fence. His heart raced as he quickly retreated into the house and locked the door. "They're here," he whispered to Clara, who immediately called the police. The men began pounding on the door, shouting threats. David grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling. "Put that down," James ordered. "No," David said firmly. "I'm not hiding anymore." The pounding grew louder, and the door began to give way. Just as the intruders broke in, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The men scattered, but two were apprehended by the officers who arrived moments later. The family sat together in silence after the ordeal, their nerves frayed. DSP Okachukwu arrived shortly after and assured them that the gang's leadership was being dismantled, but he couldn't promise complete safety. "You'll need to lay low for a while," he advised. James nodded, already planning their relocation. The next morning, the family packed their belongings and left Lagos for an undisclosed location. Though the move was painful, they knew it was necessary for their safety. David, though grateful to be alive, felt the weight of his actions heavier than ever. He vowed to make better choices and repair the damage he had caused to his family. Clara and James, while still grieving the loss of their once happy home, were hopeful that this fresh start make a lot of difference.